The acceptance letter was still warm from the printer when my dad crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. Harvard Law School, full scholarship, my name typed in bold letters across the top. 22 years of straight A's, debate team captain, student council president, volunteer work that filled 3 recommendation letters, and he threw it away like junk mail. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what he said next, while my brother Tyler stood there holding his community college rejection letter. "We can't celebrate Alex getting into Harvard when Tyler's dreams just got crushed. Family comes first." That's when I knew they'd never choose me, not even when I was the only choice left standing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds of our house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the breakfast table where my entire future had just been decided in 30 seconds. My name is Alex Thompson, and if you're watching this from wherever you are, stay with me because the day I achieved everything I'd worked for became the same day I learned my parents would sacrifice any victory of mine to protect Tyler's feelings. The envelope had arrived 3 days earlier while I was at my part-time job at the Riverside Community Center, teaching computer skills to elderly residents. Mrs. Patricia Williams, the center director, had called me into her office with a smile so wide I thought she might burst. Harvard Law School admissions had called looking for me, wanting to discuss my scholarship package, full ride, they said, room, board, everything covered. They mentioned my essay about growing up as the responsible child in a family that rewarded mediocrity over merit had moved the entire admissions committee. I drove home that evening with my heart hammering against my ribs, not from excitement but from something closer to dread. I knew that face my parents would make, the same one they'd worn when I won the state debate championship and Tyler got benched from JV basketball the same week. The face that said celebration was selfish when someone else was hurting. I pulled into our driveway on Maple Street, past Tyler's rusted pickup truck with the engine that knocked like a dying animal, past Mom's minivan with the Jesus fish sticker that had been peeling for 2 years, and sat in my old Honda Civic wondering if I should just drive away and never come back. But I didn't. I walked through the front door, called out that I was home, and found them exactly where I expected them. Dad was on his recliner watching the evening news. Mom was folding Tyler's laundry even though he was 24 and hadn't lived at home in 3 years, and Tyler himself was sprawled across the couch eating cereal from the box and complaining about his construction job. Normal, predictable, safe in their bubble of low expectations and high tolerance for disappointment. I stood there holding the envelope, my hands shaking slightly, and waited for a commercial break to speak. When it came, I cleared my throat and said the words I'd been rehearsing for 3 days. I got into Harvard Law School, full scholarship. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear Mrs. Patterson's dog barking 3 houses down. Mom looked up from Tyler's t-shirt, Dad turned his head slowly like it took effort, and Tyler stopped chewing his cereal with milk dripping down his chin. "That's nice, honey," Mom said after what felt like 10 minutes but was probably 10 seconds. Her voice had the same tone she used when I told her I'd finished my chores or remembered to take out the trash. Polite acknowledgement, nothing more. Dad nodded once and turned back to the television where a weatherman was predicting rain for the weekend. Tyler resumed eating his cereal, louder now, like the crunching could fill the space where congratulations should have been. I stood there for another moment, waiting for something more. A hug maybe, questions about when I'd leave, how long the program was, whether I was excited or nervous. Instead, I got the familiar weight of indifference, the kind that settles on your shoulders when you realize you're performing for an audience that isn't watching. I went upstairs to my room, sat on the bed I'd had since middle school, and stared at the acceptance letter until the words blurred together. Harvard Law School was pleased to inform me that I'd been selected from over 8,000 applicants. I was one of 30 students nationwide to receive their full merit scholarship. I would be studying with some of the brightest legal minds in the country, preparing for a career that could change not just my life but the lives of people I hadn't even met yet. And my family had responded like I'd told them I was thinking about getting a haircut. The next morning, I found Mom in the kitchen making Tyler's favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes with extra syrup, the kind that made the whole house smell like a carnival. She was humming some song from the radio and moving around the kitchen with more energy than I'd seen from her in months. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, where I'd done homework while she cooked dinner, where she'd helped Tyler fill out job applications when he kept getting fired from various retail positions. "Tyler's coming over for breakfast," she said without looking at me. "He's been feeling down about that college thing, so I thought I'd surprise him." The college thing? That's what she called his rejection letter from Riverside Community College, the same community college that accepted literally anyone with a high school diploma and a pulse. Tyler had applied 6 months late, submitted an essay with so many spelling errors it looked like it was written by someone having a stroke, and somehow still managed to feel victimized when they suggested he take remedial courses first. "That's nice of you," I said, meaning it. It was nice of her. It was always nice of her when it came to Tyler. When he'd crashed his first car, she'd spent her savings on a replacement. When he'd gotten fired from the grocery store for showing up drunk, she'd called her brother to get him a job at the construction company. When he'd moved in with his girlfriend and then moved back out 3 weeks later because he couldn't handle living with someone who expected him to clean up after himself, she'd prepared his old room like he was a war hero returning from battle. Tyler arrived 20 minutes later, looking exactly like what he was, a 24-year-old man who still expected his mother to solve his problems. He hugged Mom, nodded at me and sat down at the table like he owned it. Dad emerged from his morning shower, saw Tyler and suddenly became more animated than he'd been during my entire Harvard announcement. They talked about Tyler's construction job, his truck that needed new tires, his plans to maybe take some classes at the community college next semester if he could figure out the application process. I sat there eating toast and listening to them plan Tyler's future like it was a NASA mission, with Mom offering to help him study and Dad promising to co-sign for a car loan so Tyler could get something more reliable. They discussed his schedule, his goals, his dreams of maybe someday becoming a foreman or starting his own landscaping business. They spoke about his potential like it was a precious thing that needed careful handling, like one wrong move might shatter their golden boy's confidence forever. And I realized, sitting there with my coffee getting cold and my toast turning to cardboard in my mouth, that they had never once talked about my future that way. Not when I'd gotten early admission to 3 different universities. Not when I'd won the regional speech competition. Not when I'd graduated valedictorian and gave a speech to 500 people about perseverance and following your dreams while my parents sat in the 3rd row checking their phones. After breakfast, Tyler left to meet some friends, probably to drink beer behind the Walmart and complain about how unfair life was. Mom started cleaning up the kitchen, and I helped her load the dishwasher like we'd done together 1,000 times before. It felt normal, comfortable even.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Until she started talking about Tyler's hurt feelings and how hard it was for him to see other people succeed when he was struggling. She didn't say my name, but we both knew who she meant by other people. "Maybe you could wait a little while before telling everyone about Harvard," she suggested, her voice gentle but firm. "Just until Tyler gets back on his feet. You know how sensitive he is about these things." I stopped loading plates and looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been seeing my whole life but never wanted to acknowledge. She wasn't protecting Tyler from disappointment. She was protecting herself from having to admit she'd raised a son who couldn't compete with his younger sibling, who'd accidentally become everything he was supposed to be. Mom, I said carefully. This is Harvard Law School. It's kind of a big deal. She smiled the same patient smile she'd given me when I was 7 and asked why Santa brought Tyler more presents than me. I know, sweetheart. And we're very proud. We just want to be considerate of Tyler's feelings right now. You understand, don't you? I understood perfectly. I understood that my achievements made them uncomfortable because they highlighted Tyler's failures. I understood that they'd rather I succeed quietly than celebrate loudly. I understood that even when I did everything right, everything perfect, everything they claimed to want from me, it would never be enough to override their need to protect their firstborn child from the consequences of his own choices. That afternoon, I walked to the Riverside Public Library, the one place in town where I'd always felt like I could breathe. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, congratulated me on Harvard when she saw me come in. She'd heard from Mrs. Williams at the community center, who'd apparently told half the town about my scholarship. Mrs. Chen actually hugged me, and said she was going to put a congratulations sign up on the community bulletin board. She asked if my parents were planning a party, if we were going to celebrate this incredible achievement, if they were as excited as she was. I told her they were very proud, which was technically true in the most minimal sense possible. She smiled and went back to her work, and I found my usual spot in the back corner where I'd spent countless hours studying for tests, writing essays, filling out college applications while Tyler was out living his life without a care in the world. I opened my laptop and started researching Harvard's housing options, their course catalog, the professors I'd be learning from. I read about internship opportunities, study abroad programs, the kinds of careers their graduates pursued. And slowly, as I scrolled through page after page of possibilities, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in my life, I was looking at a future that belonged entirely to me. Not to Tyler, not to my parents' expectations or their need to manage everyone's feelings, but to me. Harvard didn't care that my brother couldn't get into community college. They didn't care about family dynamics or birth order or who needed more emotional support. They cared about merit, about potential, about what I could become if given the chance. I stayed at the library until closing time, and when I finally walked home under the streetlights of Maple Street, I felt different, not angry exactly, but clear. Clear about what I was dealing with, clear about what I needed to do, and clear about the fact that my family's inability to celebrate my success said absolutely nothing about the success itself. Harvard Law School had chosen me out of 8,000 applicants. That meant something, even if the people who were supposed to love me most couldn't see it. The next few days passed in a strange blur of normalcy. Mom made dinner, Dad watched television, Tyler called to complain about his boss, or his truck or whatever minor inconvenience was ruining his day. They went through the motions of family life while I went through the motions of being their daughter, but something fundamental had changed. I'd stopped waiting for them to match my energy, stopped hoping they'd suddenly develop the capacity to be proud of me the way other parents were proud of their children. Instead, I started making plans. Real plans, detailed plans, the kind of plans that would take me so far from Riverside, Ohio, that their indifference couldn't reach me anymore. I researched apartments near Harvard, part-time jobs I could take to supplement my scholarship, study groups I could join to make friends who understood what it meant to work towards something bigger than yourself. I started seeing my acceptance letter not as something that needed their validation, but as something that had already been validated by people who actually mattered. And that's when everything changed. Not because they suddenly became different parents, but because I finally became a different daughter. The daughter who stopped shrinking herself to make them comfortable, who stopped apologizing for her ambition, who stopped waiting for permission to be proud of herself. I'd spent 22 years trying to earn their attention, their praise, their basic acknowledgement that I existed as more than just Tyler's responsible little sister, but Harvard had given me something better than their approval. It had given me proof that I was worth choosing, worth investing in, worth believing in. And once I truly understood that, everything else started falling into place in ways I never could have imagined. Alex's story parts 2. 5. Tyler's rejection letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by the same mail carrier who'd brought my Harvard acceptance 3 days earlier. I was upstairs in my room, researching student housing options and trying to figure out which meal plan would work best with my schedule, when I heard the sound that would change everything. Not the mailbox closing or footsteps on the porch, but Tyler's voice rising from the kitchen like a wounded animal, raw and desperate and completely unhinged. "This is bullshit. Complete bullshit. How can they reject me? I'm a Thompson. Dad went to school here." He was talking about Riverside Community College, the same institution that had sent acceptance letters to kids who could barely read their own names. The same college that offered remedial math for people who struggled with basic addition, remedial English for those who couldn't write a complete sentence, and remedial study skills for students who'd never learned how to open a textbook. I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down into the kitchen, where Tyler was pacing back and forth like a caged tiger, waving the thin envelope in the air. Mom was standing at the sink, her shoulders rigid with tension, while Dad sat at the table staring at the letter like it contained nuclear launch codes. The scene was almost absurd, watching 3 adults react to a community college rejection with the gravity of a natural disaster, but nothing about my family's priorities had ever made sense to outsiders. "They want me to take placement tests," Tyler continued, his voice cracking with indignation. "Placement tests. Like I'm some kind of idiot who doesn't know basic English and math." The irony was staggering, considering Tyler had graduated high school with a 2.1 GPA and had asked me to help him spell definitely just last month. But reality had never been Tyler's strong suit, and our parents had spent years enabling his delusions rather than helping him face the truth about his capabilities. Mom turned from the sink, her face already shifting into crisis management mode. "Sweetheart, maybe the placement tests are just routine. Maybe everyone has to take them." Her voice carried that particular tone she used when she was trying to rewrite reality to make Tyler feel better, the same tone she'd used when she convinced him that getting fired from 3 jobs in 6 months wasn't his fault, but just bad luck with difficult managers. Dad cleared his throat and reached for the letter, reading it with the concentration of a scholar examining ancient texts. "It says here they'll reevaluate your application after you complete developmental coursework in mathematics and composition." He looked up at Tyler with genuine confusion, as if he couldn't understand why any institution would question his son's academic readiness. "That doesn't seem fair. You graduated from Riverside High just like everyone else." The fact that Tyler had graduated from Riverside High with barely passing grades, after repeating 2 classes and requiring extensive tutoring from me throughout his senior year, seemed to have escaped Dad's memory entirely. It was easier to blame the college than to acknowledge that Tyler's academic struggles were the predictable result of 18 years of choosing sports over studying, parties over preparation, and excuses over effort. I watched from my hiding spot as the 3 of them began constructing an elaborate narrative about how the college must have made a mistake, how Tyler's application must not have been properly reviewed, how his high school transcripts probably didn't accurately reflect his intelligence. They spoke about contacting the admissions office, demanding a second review, maybe even getting a lawyer involved if necessary. They treated Tyler's rejection like a civil rights violation, rather than the logical consequence of submitting a subpar application 6 months past the deadline. What struck me most wasn't their denial, which I'd witnessed countless times before, but their energy. Mom was already reaching for her phone to call her sister, who knew someone who worked at the college. Dad was talking about driving over there tomorrow to speak with the admissions director personally. Tyler was nodding along, his earlier devastation transforming into righteous anger at the unfairness of a system that couldn't recognize his potential. They were mobilizing like a military unit preparing for battle, ready to move heaven and earth to get Tyler into a community college that accepted 97% of applicants. They were prepared to call in favors, make connections, spend money they didn't have, and exhaust every possible resource to secure him a spot in remedial courses that he should have been able to test into without difficulty. And I realized, sitting there on the stairs clutching my Harvard acceptance letter, that they had never once shown this level of concern for my educational future. When I'd needed help with my college applications, I'd figured it out myself using library computers and free online resources. When I'd required recommendation letters, I'd approached teachers and employers on my own, never asking my parents to make calls or pull strings. When I'd worried about affording college, I'd research scholarships and financial aid options independently, spending hours filling out applications and writing essays while Tyler was out with friends. Not once had they offered to make phone calls on my behalf, to use their connections, to fight for my opportunities. They'd assumed I could handle everything myself because I always had, because I'd made their lives easier by being self-sufficient and responsible. But Tyler's minor setback had them ready to wage war against an entire educational system. The conversation downstairs continued for another hour, with Mom eventually calling her sister, who promised to reach out to her contact at the college first thing Monday morning. Dad started making a list of talking points for his planned visit to the admissions office, while Tyler alternated between sulking and declaring that maybe college wasn't for him anyway, maybe he'd just focus on his construction job and work his way up to management without wasting time on classes. Each time Tyler mentioned giving up on college entirely, Mom and Dad immediately launched into speeches about the importance of education, about not letting one setback derail his future, about the doors that a degree could open for him. They painted vivid pictures of the career opportunities waiting for college graduates, the financial security that comes with higher education, the respect and recognition he'd earn by completing his studies. These were the same parents who had never once discussed my college plans with enthusiasm, who had never painted pictures of my potential future, who had treated my academic achievements like background noise in the Tyler show that dominated every family conversation. When I'd received early admission offers from multiple universities, they'd nodded politely and returned to discussing Tyler's latest workplace drama. When I'd been accepted to pre-law programs that could launch a career in civil rights or environmental law, they'd responded with the same energy they might show for news about my dentist appointment. But Tyler's potential enrollment in remedial courses at community college was being treated like a matter of national importance, worthy of family meetings and strategic planning sessions. They were discussing his future with the same intensity that other parents might reserve for their child getting into medical school or landing a prestigious internship. By evening, Tyler had been thoroughly reassured that his rejection was temporary, that the family would fight for his rightful place at Riverside Community College, that his dreams of eventual success were still entirely achievable. Mom had prepared his favorite dinner. Dad had promised to take a day off work to accompany him to the admissions office, and they'd all agreed that sometimes the best students face the most obstacles because the system isn't designed for people with Tyler's unique combination of intelligence and independence. I ate dinner with them that night, listening to their revised version of events where Tyler's rejection became evidence of his specialness rather than his academic deficiencies. They spoke about him like he was a misunderstood genius, whose talents simply couldn't be measured by conventional standards, a creative thinker who didn't fit into the rigid boxes that institutions use to evaluate students. Meanwhile, my Harvard acceptance letter remained tucked away in my backpack, unmentioned and uncelebrated, as relevant to the family conversation as last week's grocery list. Nobody asked about my plans for the fall. Nobody wondered how I was feeling about leaving home. Nobody expressed pride or excitement about having a daughter who'd earned a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the world. After dinner, I helped Mom clean the kitchen while Dad and Tyler relocated to the living room to watch television and continue their discussion of strategy for conquering the community college admissions process. Mom worked in focused silence, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary, her jaw set in the determined expression she wore when she was solving problems for her children. Tyler's always been sensitive about school, she said, eventually not looking at me. He learns differently than other people, more hands-on, more practical. These standardized tests and placement exams don't really capture what he's capable of. She spoke with the conviction of someone who'd spent years creating explanations for Tyler's struggles, crafting narratives that transformed his limitations into alternative strengths. I continued drying plates and putting them away, wondering if she'd ever crafted similar narratives for me. Had she ever explained to teachers or neighbors that I was special in my own way, that my achievements reflected a different kind of intelligence, that my successes deserved recognition and celebration? Or had my competence simply made me invisible, another task crossed off her daily to-do list rather than a daughter whose accomplishments brought joy and pride to the family? He just needs someone to believe in him, Mom continued, her voice taking on the passionate edge it always carried when she defended Tyler. He needs to know that his family is in his corner, that we'll fight for his opportunities, that we won't let him give up on himself. She was building the case for why Tyler deserved their complete attention and support, why his minor setback required major intervention, why his dreams needed protection from the harsh realities of academic evaluation. I wanted to ask her who had believed in me during all those years of studying alone in my room, completing projects that earned recognition from teachers who assumed I had supportive parents cheering me on from home. I wanted to know who had been in my corner when I'd worked 30 hours a week throughout high school to save money for college, when I'd stayed up until midnight researching scholarship opportunities, when I'd written essay after essay about overcoming obstacles without ever mentioning the biggest obstacle of all, which was being the daughter who didn't need saving. But I didn't ask those questions because I already knew the answers, and because Mom was already planning Tyler's victory parade before he'd even retaken his placement tests. She was discussing tutoring options and study schedules and motivational strategies with the enthusiasm of a campaign manager preparing for election season. She was ready to invest time, energy, and resources into Tyler's community college aspirations, with an intensity that would have been appropriate for someone preparing for medical school admissions. That night, lying in bed and listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling into sleep, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. My family didn't just prefer Tyler over me, they needed Tyler to be more important than me. My success made them uncomfortable because it highlighted their failures as parents, their inability to raise two equally capable children, their investment in maintaining Tyler's position as the family's primary concern. They couldn't celebrate my Harvard acceptance because doing so would require acknowledging that the daughter they'd consistently overlooked had achieved something their precious son couldn't even imagine reaching for. They couldn't show pride in my accomplishments without confronting the fact that all their attention, encouragement, and support had been directed toward the child who needed it least and delivered it least effectively. Tyler's rejection from community college wasn't just his failure, it was theirs. It was proof that their parenting strategy of protection over preparation, excuses over accountability, and comfort over growth had produced a young man who couldn't compete in even the most basic academic environment. But rather than examining their approach or helping Tyler develop real skills and discipline, they chose to treat his rejection as an external problem that required external solutions. My Harvard acceptance, on the other hand, was evidence that their neglect hadn't destroyed me, that I'd managed to succeed without their guidance or support, that the daughter they'd treated as an afterthought had somehow become everything they'd hoped Tyler might achieve. And instead of feeling proud or grateful or amazed, they felt threatened and uncomfortable and eager to redirect attention back to where it felt safer. Over the next few days, the house buzzed with activity around Tyler's community college campaign. Mom made phone calls,
Dad scheduled meetings, and Tyler himself began to embrace his role as the wronged party fighting against an unfair system. They spoke about his situation with neighbors,
friends, and extended family, gathering support for their mission to get him properly enrolled and recognized for his potential. Meanwhile, I continued my Harvard preparations in relative silence, researching everything I could about campus life, academic expectations, and career opportunities. I read about the law school's clinical programs, where students could work on real cases involving immigration rights, environmental justice, and civil liberties. I learned about professors who'd argued cases before the Supreme Court, who'd written legislation that changed people's lives, who'd dedicated their careers to using legal knowledge as a tool for social progress. The contrast between my family's obsession with Tyler's community college placement tests and my own research into constitutional law and international human rights would have been funny if it wasn't so perfectly representative of how we'd always operated. They were treating Tyler's remedial coursework like a stepping stone to greatness, while treating my full scholarship to Harvard like a routine administrative detail that barely merited acknowledgement. But something was shifting inside me during those days of watching them mobilize around Tyler's minor crisis while ignoring my major achievement. I was beginning to understand that their reaction wasn't really about Tyler or about me, it was about them and their need to maintain a family narrative that made sense of their choices over the past 2 decades. They needed Tyler to be the child with potential because they'd invested everything in that story. They needed me to be the child who didn't require attention because acknowledging my accomplishments would force them to confront how badly they'd misallocated their emotional resources. They needed to believe that Tyler's struggles were external obstacles rather than internal limitations because the alternative would mean accepting responsibility for enabling his weaknesses instead of developing his strengths, and I needed to stop caring about their needs long enough to focus on my own, which were finally, for the first time in my life, being recognized and valued by people who mattered. Harvard Law School had chosen me not because I was the best option available to them, but because I was genuinely excellent, because I demonstrated the kind of intellectual capability and personal drive that suggested I could make meaningful contributions to the legal profession and to society as a whole. That recognition, that validation, that investment in my potential was worth more than anything my family could offer me, even if they'd suddenly developed the capacity for appropriate parental pride. Harvard's belief in me was based on evidence and merit, not biology and obligation. Their support came with opportunities and resources, not conditions and limitations. By the end of that week, I realized I was already gone. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally and psychologically I had detached from the family dynamic that had shaped my entire life up to that point. I was still sleeping in my childhood bedroom and eating dinner at the kitchen table where I'd done homework for 12 years, but I was no longer waiting for their approval or hoping for their attention. I was counting down the days until I could leave for Cambridge, where people would judge me based on what I contributed rather than how I compared to someone else, where my achievements would be celebrated rather than minimized, where I could finally discover who I was when I wasn't trying to make myself small enough to fit around someone else's fragile ego. The irony was perfect and painful. After 22 years of putting Tyler first, of protecting his feelings and managing his disappointments and celebrating his minor victories while treating my major ones like background noise, they were about to lose both of us. Tyler would eventually get into community college, struggle through remedial courses, and probably drop out within 2 semesters when the reality of academic work finally caught up with his inflated sense of his own capabilities. And I would be gone, not just to college but gone from their lives in every meaningful way, because I'd finally learned the difference between being someone's daughter and being someone's afterthought. Harvard had taught me that lesson before I'd even stepped foot on campus, simply by choosing me when everyone else had been choosing anyone but me. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was quiet and certain, like watching the sun rise on a morning when you know everything is about to change. I was still Alex Thompson from Maple Street in Riverside, Ohio, but I was also becoming someone else, someone who didn't need permission to take up space or apologize for taking opportunities that others couldn't reach. Someone who was finally ready to be chosen because she'd learned how to choose herself. Alex's story part 3. The confirmation came on a Saturday morning while I was making pancakes for the family, the same ritual I'd performed nearly every weekend for the past 5 years. Mom had stopped cooking weekend breakfasts around the time Tyler graduated high school, claiming she was too tired from her work week to manage morning meals. Naturally, the responsibility had fallen to me, the daughter who could be counted on to fill gaps without complaint or recognition. I was standing at the stove, flipping golden circles of batter, while listening to Dad and Tyler discuss their strategy for Monday's community college meeting, when Mom's phone rang. She answered with her usual cheerful voice, the one she reserved for neighbors and extended family, but I watched her expression change as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Martinez," she said, and I immediately knew this was Jamie's mother calling. Jamie Martinez had been my closest friend since middle school, one of the few people in Riverside who understood what it meant to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Her mother worked as a secretary at Riverside High School, which meant she had access to information that traveled through the faculty lounge faster than wildfire. "Yes, that's wonderful news," Mom continued, but her voice had taken on that strained quality she used when she was trying to sound enthusiastic about something that made her uncomfortable. "We're very proud of Alex. Harvard is quite an achievement." There was a long pause while she listened, and I could see her glancing toward the living room where Dad and Tyler were still deep in their community college planning session, a celebration. "Oh, that's so thoughtful of you to offer, but we're keeping things quiet right now. Family situation, you understand, maybe after Tyler gets settled with his school plans." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, I know it's Harvard. Yes, I understand it's a big deal. We're just trying to be sensitive to everyone's feelings right now." I stood there with the spatula in my hand, watching my mother politely decline a celebration for my full scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the world, because it might hurt Tyler's feelings about his community college rejection. She was literally turning down congratulations from our neighbors, deflecting praise from family friends, asking people to contain their excitement about my achievement so that Tyler wouldn't have to confront the gap between his potential and his reality. The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Mrs. Martinez apparently pressing for details about my plans, my major, my timeline for leaving home. Mom answered in vague, distant terms, like she was discussing someone else's daughter rather than her own. She mentioned that I'd probably study law, that I'd be leaving in the fall, that it was all very exciting but also overwhelming for the family. When she finally hung up, she sat at the kitchen table and rubbed her temples like she had a headache. "Mrs. Martinez heard about Harvard from someone at the school," she said, not looking at me. "Apparently it's all over town. The librarians are talking about it, some of your old teachers are asking questions." She wanted to know if we were planning any kind of party or announcement. I continued making pancakes, adding batter to the pan with mechanical precision while processing what I'd just witnessed. My acceptance to Harvard Law School was spreading through Riverside's social networks, generating excitement and pride among people who barely knew me, while my own family was actively working to suppress any public acknowledgement of what I'd accomplished. "What did you tell her?" I asked, though I'd heard every word of the conversation. "I told her we're keeping things low-key right now," Mom replied, still not meeting my eyes. "With Tyler's situation being what it is, we don't want to make things harder for him. You understand, don't you? Family comes first, and right now Tyler needs our support more than you need a celebration." The logic was so twisted it took me a moment to fully grasp what she was saying. Tyler needed their support because he'd been rejected from community college, which meant I couldn't receive recognition for being accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship. Tyler's failure required the family's complete attention, which meant my success had to be minimized, hidden, treated like a shameful secret that might damage his fragile self-esteem. "Mrs. Martinez seemed pretty excited," I said carefully, testing the waters. "She mentioned that I'm the first student from Riverside High to get into Harvard in over a decade. She thought it might be nice to put something in the local newspaper, maybe inspire other kids to aim higher." Mom's reaction was immediate and sharp. "Absolutely not. We are not putting anything in the newspaper. Can you imagine how Tyler would feel, seeing your picture and your achievement published for everyone to read?" He's already struggling with his confidence, and the last thing he needs is a public reminder that his little sister accomplished something he couldn't even dream of attempting. There it was, laid out in plain language. My achievement was being treated not as something to celebrate but as something that could be weaponized against Tyler's self-worth. My scholarship to Harvard wasn't a family triumph, it was a potential source of embarrassment that needed to be managed carefully to avoid damaging the golden child's psyche. I finished the pancakes in silence and called everyone to breakfast, watching as Mom and Dad fussed over Tyler's plate, making sure he had enough syrup, asking if he wanted more coffee, treating him like visiting royalty rather than a grown man who lived in his own apartment and worked full-time in construction. The contrast with their treatment of me was so stark it would have been comedic if it wasn't so devastating. During breakfast, Dad brought up a conversation he'd had with his brother, Uncle Jim, who'd apparently also heard about my Harvard acceptance through the Riverside Gossip Network. Jim called this morning, Dad said between bites of pancake. He heard some rumor about Alex getting into college somewhere fancy. I told him it wasn't really confirmed yet, that we were still waiting to hear about financial aid and all that. I stared at him across the table, my fork halfway to my mouth. Dad, I got a full scholarship. It's completely confirmed. Harvard called to discuss the details. There's no waiting involved. He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. Well, you know how these things work. Sometimes there are conditions, requirements you have to meet, ways things can fall through. I didn't want Jim getting all excited about something that might not work out. He glanced at Tyler, who was methodically destroying his stack of pancakes with unnecessary force. Besides, we've got other priorities right now. Tyler's education is the immediate concern. The casual dismissal of my Harvard acceptance as something that might not work out while treating Tyler's community college placement tests as a matter of urgent family business was so perfectly representative of our family dynamics that I almost laughed. They were willing to publicly deny my confirmed acceptance to one of the world's most prestigious universities, while privately mobilizing every resource to help Tyler qualify for remedial courses at a local community college. After breakfast, I helped clean up while listening to Mom and Dad continue their strategic planning for Tyler's academic future. They discussed tutoring options, study schedules, and motivational techniques with the intensity of military commanders preparing for a crucial battle. They were treating his placement test preparation like a doctoral dissertation defense, complete with backup plans and contingency strategies. Meanwhile, nobody asked me about housing preferences at Harvard, course selection deadlines, or orientation activities. Nobody wondered how I was feeling about leaving home, whether I was nervous about the academic workload, or if I needed help preparing for the transition to college life. My impending departure for one of the most challenging academic environments in the country was being treated as a minor administrative detail that would sort itself out without family involvement. That afternoon, I decided to walk to the Riverside Community Center where I worked part-time, needing space to process what I'd witnessed during breakfast and the phone conversation with Mrs. Martinez. The center was mostly empty on weekends, just Mrs. Patricia Williams catching up on paperwork in her office and a few elderly residents using the exercise equipment in the back room. Williams looked up when I knocked on her office door, her face immediately brightening with the genuine excitement that my own parents seemed incapable of showing. "Alex, perfect timing. I was just updating our newsletter, and I wanted to include a feature about your Harvard acceptance. This is exactly the kind of success story our community needs to hear about." I sat down across from her desk, feeling the weight of the morning's conversation settling on my shoulders. "Actually, Mrs. Williams, my family would prefer to keep things quiet right now. They're concerned about, well, family dynamics and not wanting to make anyone feel bad about their own situations." She frowned, clearly confused by my reluctance. "Alex, you earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. This is extraordinary. Your achievement reflects not just your own hard work, but the quality of education and support available in our community. Why would anyone want to keep something like this quiet?" I struggled to find words that would explain my family's logic without completely exposing how dysfunctional our priorities had become. "My brother is dealing with some college application issues right now, and my parents think it might be insensitive to publicize my acceptance while he's struggling with his own educational plans."
Mrs. Williams leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the perceptive expression of someone who'd spent decades working with families and understanding the complicated dynamics that often existed beneath surface appearances. Alex, can I ask you something? How long have you been managing other people's feelings about your accomplishments? The question hit like a physical blow, so direct and accurate that I felt tears starting to form before I could control them. What do you mean? I mean, in the 3 years you've worked here, I've watched you downplay every achievement, deflect every compliment, and apologize for every success like it was something you'd done wrong. You got the highest SAT scores in your graduating class and acted like it was an accident. You won that regional debate championship and spent the victory party helping other students feel better about their losses. You've been accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, and you're sitting in my office asking me to keep it quiet so your brother doesn't feel bad about community college. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. At what point do you get to be proud of yourself? At what point do your achievements matter as much as everyone else's feelings? At what point do you stop being responsible for managing other people's reactions to your success? I sat there in silence, tears now flowing freely down my face, unable to answer her questions because I'd never considered that there might be alternatives to the role I'd been playing my entire life. I'd been the daughter who made things easier for everyone else, who solved problems without creating them, who succeeded without requiring attention or celebration or basic acknowledgement. Mrs. Williams, I said finally, my voice shaky, I don't think my family knows how to be proud of me. I think my success makes them uncomfortable because it highlights problems they don't want to address. I think they need me to be smaller so other people can feel bigger. She reached across the desk and handed me a box of tissues, her expression gentle but firm. Alex, that's not your responsibility. Your job isn't to make yourself smaller so other people feel more comfortable. Your job isn't to manage your family's emotions about your achievements, your job is to be proud of what you've accomplished and to pursue the opportunities you've earned. We talked for another hour about family dynamics, about the difference between supporting struggling family members and sacrificing high-achieving ones, about the toxic pattern of treating success as something that needed to be hidden or apologized for. Mrs. Williams shared stories about other young people she'd worked with who'd been taught to diminish themselves for the sake of family harmony, who'd been made to feel guilty about their talents and ambitions. The saddest part, she said as our conversation wound down, is that families think they're protecting the struggling child by minimizing the successful one. But what they're really doing is teaching both children that achievement should be met with discomfort, that excellence is something to be ashamed of, that family love is conditional on everyone staying at the same level. When I left the community center that evening, I felt like I'd been given permission to want what I'd earned, to feel proud of what I'd accomplished, to stop apologizing for being good at things that other people found difficult. Mrs. Williams had articulated something I'd sensed but couldn't name, the toxic family pattern that had shaped my entire understanding of success and recognition. That night at dinner, Tyler announced that he'd decided to take a break from thinking about college applications and focus on his construction job instead. Maybe he'd try again next year, he said, when he felt more prepared and motivated. Maybe college wasn't the right path for him anyway, since he was making decent money in construction and enjoyed working with his hands. Mom and Dad immediately launched into their familiar routine of reassurance and encouragement, explaining why college was important, how education opened doors, how he shouldn't give up on his dreams just because of one minor setback. They painted vivid pictures of his potential future, the management positions he could earn, the respect he'd command with a degree, the financial security that higher education could provide. I listened to them desperately trying to motivate Tyler to pursue an education he'd never shown genuine interest in, while simultaneously working to suppress any public acknowledgement of my acceptance to one of the world's premier educational institutions. They were begging Tyler to care about college while asking me to pretend I didn't care about Harvard. The contradiction was so glaring, so perfectly representative of everything that was wrong with our family dynamics, that I finally understood what Mrs. Williams had been trying to tell me. This wasn't about Tyler's feelings, or his confidence, or his need for support. This was about my parents' inability to accept that they'd raised two very different children, that their parenting strategies had produced vastly different results, that their investment in Tyler as the family's primary concern had created a situation where my achievements threatened the narrative they'd constructed about their own success as parents. They needed Tyler to succeed because his success would validate their approach, would prove that their attention and support and resources had been well invested. They needed me to minimize my success because it suggested that maybe their attention and support and resources weren't actually necessary for achievement, that maybe the child they'd overlooked had accomplished more than the child they'd prioritized. My Harvard acceptance wasn't just my victory, it was evidence of their failure to recognize, encourage, and celebrate the daughter who'd been succeeding without their help all along. And rather than examining their choices or adjusting their approach, they were choosing to treat my achievement as a problem that needed to be managed rather than a success that deserved recognition. That realization, painful as it was, also brought a strange sense of relief. I finally understood that their reaction to my Harvard acceptance wasn't really about me at all, it was about them, their choices, their needs, their inability to handle the cognitive dissonance between the child they'd invested in and the child who'd actually delivered results. And once I understood that, I could finally stop taking responsibility for their comfort, their feelings, their need to maintain a family narrative that made sense of their priorities. I could stop shrinking myself to make them feel better about their choices. I could stop apologizing for achieving things they'd never encouraged me to pursue. For the first time in my life, I could start focusing on what I wanted, what I'd earned, and where I was going, rather than managing everyone else's reactions to my journey. Harvard had chosen me, and now it was time for me to choose myself, even if that meant choosing differently than my family would prefer. The decision felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that jumping might be the only way to discover you could fly. Alex's Story Part 4, Final. The letter sat on my desk for 3 days before I found the courage to write it. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because once I put those words on paper, there would be no pretending anymore, no more hoping they'd suddenly develop the capacity for appropriate parental pride. No more waiting for them to choose me over their need to protect Tyler from reality. No more shrinking myself to fit around their dysfunction. I started writing on a Wednesday evening after another dinner where they discussed Tyler's future plans with passionate intensity while treating my impending departure for Harvard like background noise. Mom had spent 20 minutes explaining to Tyler why he shouldn't give up on college, painting elaborate pictures of the doors that education could open, the respect he'd command with a degree, the financial security that higher learning provided. Meanwhile, she'd responded to my question about whether they wanted to visit Harvard's campus with a distracted "we'll see" before returning to Tyler's motivational session. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. They were desperately trying to convince Tyler to value education while actively devaluing my acceptance to one of the world's most prestigious educational institutions. They were painting college as the key to success and fulfillment, while refusing to celebrate my full scholarship to Harvard Law School. They were treating Tyler's potential community college enrollment as worthy of family meetings and strategic planning, while treating my confirmed acceptance to an Ivy League institution as an inconvenient detail that threatened family harmony. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, not from anger but from clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally understand that some relationships are built on foundations too broken to repair, when you realize that love isn't supposed to require you to make yourself smaller, when you accept that sometimes the healthiest choice is to stop trying to earn what should have been freely given. Dear Mom and Dad, I began, then stopped and started over. They didn't deserve the intimacy of Mom and Dad anymore. They'd forfeited that privilege through years of treating me like a supporting character in Tyler's story. To Robert and Linda Thompson, I wrote instead, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not just to college, but gone from your lives in every meaningful way, because I've finally learned the difference between being someone's daughter and being someone's afterthought. I wrote about the crumpled Harvard acceptance letter, about their response to my full scholarship, about the phone conversation with Mrs. Martinez, where Mom had actively discouraged public recognition of my achievement. I wrote about the breakfast where Dad had told Uncle Jim that my Harvard acceptance wasn't confirmed, about their request that I keep quiet about my success to protect Tyler's feelings. But I also wrote about the pattern that went back much further than my college acceptance. I wrote about the broken arm at 7, when they made me wait an hour because Belle had dance rehearsal. I wrote about graduating valedictorian to an audience where my own parents spent the ceremony checking their phones. I wrote about years of straight A's that earned polite nods while Tyler's occasional C+ received celebration and rewards. You taught me that love in this family comes with conditions, I continued, the words flowing faster now, that achievements must be hidden if they make Tyler uncomfortable. That success should be apologized for rather than celebrated, that my job was to be useful, reliable, and invisible while Tyler got to be human, flawed, and prioritized. I wrote about Mrs. Williams and her question about how long I'd been managing other people's feelings about my accomplishments. I wrote about the toxic pattern of treating success as something shameful, about families who think they're protecting the struggling child by sacrificing the achieving one. I wrote about the difference between supporting someone who needs help and enabling someone who refuses to grow. Tyler's rejection from community college became a family crisis requiring strategic planning and emotional support, I wrote. My acceptance to Harvard with a full scholarship became a family secret requiring careful management to avoid hurting feelings. The contrast tells me everything I need to know about my value in this house. The hardest part to write was the section about what I'd wanted from them, about the celebration that never came, about the pride they'd never expressed, about the basic parental recognition that I'd earned and deserved. I'd wanted them at my debate competitions, cheering when I won regional championships. I'd wanted them to frame my academic awards instead of storing them in a drawer. I'd wanted them to brag about my achievements to neighbors and friends instead of deflecting attention away from my successes. I wanted you to be proud of me, I wrote, tears blurring the words. Not because I was perfect, not because I never caused problems, but because I was your daughter and I'd worked hard and achieved something extraordinary. I wanted you to celebrate my Harvard acceptance the way you celebrated Tyler's job at the construction company. I wanted you to show the same enthusiasm for my law school plans that you showed for Tyler's community college placement tests. I explained my decision to leave without drama, without confrontation, without giving
Then the opportunity to make my departure about Tyler's needs or feelings. I'd secured housing near campus, arranged transportation, organized my finances, and planned my exit with the same methodical approach I'd used for everything else in my life that mattered. You'll probably tell people I was ungrateful, that I didn't appreciate everything you did for me, that I chose strangers over family, I wrote. But the truth is that the strangers at Harvard showed more faith in my potential in one acceptance letter than you've shown in 22 years of being my parents. They invested in my future while you invested in Tyler's comfort. They celebrated my achievements while you minimized them. The final paragraph was the hardest to write because it meant acknowledging that this wasn't a temporary separation or a dramatic gesture designed to get their attention. This was a permanent redefinition of our relationship, a recognition that some damage can't be undone and some patterns can't be changed. I'm not writing this to hurt you or to punish you, I concluded. I'm writing this to free both of us from a dynamic that was never healthy and was never going to improve. You can continue prioritizing Tyler's feelings over everyone else's achievements. You can keep protecting him from the consequences of his choices while enabling his weaknesses. But you'll be doing it without me. I signed the letter simply Alex and placed it in an envelope on my desk. Then I began packing, not everything but enough to start fresh somewhere else. I took my important documents, my laptop, my books, a few photographs from happier times when I still believed I could earn their love through excellence. I left behind the academic awards they'd never displayed, the trophies they'd never celebrated, the evidence of achievements they'd never acknowledged. My departure was scheduled for early morning while they were still sleeping, before the daily routine of managing Tyler's emotions and planning his future could begin again. I'd arranged for a taxi to take me to the bus station, where I'd board a Greyhound to Cambridge. Not the most elegant way to travel to Harvard, but it felt appropriate somehow.
I was leaving the same way I'd lived in their house, quietly and without requiring their attention or resources. The night before I left, I sat at the kitchen table where I'd done homework for 12 years, where I'd filled out college applications while they watched Tyler's basketball games on television, where I'd eaten countless meals while listening to discussions about Tyler's problems, dreams, and potential. The house was quiet, everyone asleep, and for the first time in years I felt peaceful rather than overlooked. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired of being the daughter who didn't matter as much as the son who couldn't succeed despite every advantage. I was tired of celebrating other people's minor victories while my major ones went unnoticed. I was tired of making myself smaller so Tyler could feel bigger, of hiding my light so his dimness wouldn't be as obvious. Harvard had given me something my family never could: validation that came without conditions, recognition that wasn't contingent on someone else's feelings, an investment in my potential that didn't require me to minimize myself. They'd chosen me out of thousands of applicants, not because I was safe or convenient or non-threatening, but because I was excellent. At 5:30 in the morning, I placed the letter on the kitchen table, picked up my suitcase, and walked out the front door of 412 Maple Street for the last time. The taxi was waiting, the driver half asleep but professional, and as we drove through the empty streets of Riverside toward the bus station, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the complete absence of guilt about choosing myself over my family's needs. 3 hours later, I was on a Greyhound bus heading east toward Massachusetts, toward Harvard, toward a future that belonged entirely to me. I didn't look back at Riverside disappearing behind me because there was nothing there worth seeing anymore. My family had made their choice long ago, consistently and repeatedly choosing Tyler over me, his comfort over my achievements, his potential over my reality. Now everyone else was choosing me over them, and that felt like the most natural thing in the world. The phone calls started 3 days after I'd settled into my tiny studio apartment near Harvard campus. Robert Thompson, the man who'd spent 22 years treating my achievements like inconvenient background noise, was suddenly desperate to reach me. The voicemails began polite, almost casual, as if he was calling to discuss weekend dinner plans rather than the complete collapse of our family relationship. "Alex, it's Dad. We found your letter. We need to talk. Call me back when you get this." His voice carried that particular tone he used when he was trying to sound reasonable while completely missing the point, the same voice he'd used to explain why I couldn't have a birthday party because it might upset Tyler, why my debate championship wasn't worth celebrating because Tyler had struck out at his baseball game that same week. By the fourth day, the messages became more urgent, more desperate, though still filtered through the same fundamental misunderstanding that had characterized our relationship my entire life. "Alex, your mother is beside herself. We don't understand why you're being so dramatic about this. We've always been proud of you. Come home so we can work this out as a family." The word dramatic almost made me laugh. 22 years of quiet compliance, of managing everyone else's emotions, of succeeding without celebration or recognition, and my decision to finally choose myself was being labeled dramatic. The daughter who'd never caused a scene, never demanded attention, never asked for more than basic acknowledgement, was suddenly being accused of theatrics because she'd stopped accepting crumbs from people who should have offered her the whole cake. Linda Thompson's messages were different, more emotional, more manipulative in the way that mothers who've failed their children often become when confronted with the consequences of their choices. "Sweetheart, you're breaking my heart. I don't know what we did wrong, but we can fix it. Tyler is devastated that you left because of him. He never wanted to come between you and your dreams. Please just come home and let's talk about this." The irony was staggering. Tyler was devastated that I'd left because of him, yet for 22 years, nobody had cared that I was devastated by constantly being sacrificed for his comfort. Tyler never wanted to come between me and my dreams, but they'd spent decades ensuring that his feelings took priority over my achievements. Now that I'd removed myself from the equation, they were suddenly concerned about family harmony and emotional damage. But it was Tyler's own voicemail, left on the 7th day, that revealed the true depth of their denial. "Alex, this is insane. Mom and Dad are freaking out, calling everyone looking for you, acting like you died or something. I told them you're probably just being overdramatic because you didn't get enough attention for the Harvard thing. You know how you get when you think people aren't paying enough attention to your accomplishments. Just come home and stop making everything about you for once." That message, more than anything else, crystallized exactly why I'd needed to leave. Tyler genuinely believed that my departure was about wanting more attention for my Harvard acceptance, that my decision to remove myself from their toxic dynamic was just another example of my supposed selfishness. He couldn't conceive that the problem wasn't my need for attention, but their complete inability to provide basic parental recognition and support. The fact that he described my Harvard Law School full scholarship as the Harvard thing, like it was a minor hobby, rather than a life-changing achievement, told me everything I needed to know about how deeply ingrained their dysfunction had become. They'd spent so many years minimizing my successes that Tyler actually believed Harvard was just another example of me seeking unnecessary attention for ordinary accomplishments. I didn't return any of the calls. Instead, I threw myself into preparing for law school with the same methodical dedication I'd applied to everything else that mattered to me. I researched professors, read recommended texts, connected with other incoming students through online forums. I explored Cambridge, finding coffee shops where I could study, parks where I could walk when the intensity of preparation became overwhelming, bookstores where I could lose myself among legal texts and philosophical treatises. Harvard's campus was everything I'd imagined and more. Walking through Harvard Yard, seeing students engaged in passionate discussions about constitutional law and social justice, sitting in library where future Supreme Court justices and civil rights leaders had once studied, I felt like I'd finally found my tribe. These were people who understood that excellence wasn't something to apologize for, that achievement was worthy of celebration, that intellectual curiosity was a gift to be nurtured rather than minimized. Professor Sarah Mitchell, who taught first-year constitutional law, became an unexpected mentor during those early weeks. She'd heard about my unusual arrival story through the Student Services Office, how I'd shown up with a single suitcase and no family support system, how I'd funded my move to Cambridge entirely through my own savings. During her office hours one afternoon, she asked me about my background, my motivation for studying law, my plans for using my education. "I've been reading your application essay," she said, pulling out a file from her desk. "You wrote about growing up as the responsible child in a family that rewarded mediocrity over merit. That's a powerful motivation for pursuing justice, the experience of watching fairness and recognition be distributed based on politics rather than performance." We talked for an hour about my vision for using law as a tool for social change, about cases involving family court reform and educational equity, about the ways that legal systems could be improved to protect high-achieving children from families that prioritized emotional management over individual growth. Professor Mitchell shared stories about other students who'd overcome difficult family situations, who'd used their personal experiences with unfairness as motivation for creating more just systems. The students who succeed best in law school, she told me, are often those who've experienced injustice personally and want to prevent it from happening to others. Your family's inability to recognize your achievements has given you a unique perspective on how recognition and resources should be allocated based on merit rather than favoritism. Meanwhile, back in Riverside, my absence was apparently creating exactly the kind of crisis I'd predicted. Mrs. Williams from the community center called my new phone number, which I'd given her as my emergency contact, to let me know that my parents had been calling everyone they could think of, asking if anyone knew where I'd gone. They'd contacted the police, who'd explained that a 22-year-old leaving home voluntarily wasn't a missing person case. They'd called Harvard directly, trying to get information about my enrollment status and campus housing. Your mother came to the center yesterday, Mrs. Williams told me. She wanted to know if I'd heard from you, if I had any idea where you might have gone. She seemed genuinely shocked that you'd actually left, like she couldn't believe you'd follow through on removing yourself from their lives. The fact that they were shocked by my departure revealed how completely they'd misunderstood our relationship. They'd apparently believed that I would continue accepting their treatment indefinitely, that my compliance and reliability meant I would never choose myself over their dysfunction. They'd taken my 22 years of quiet acceptance as evidence that I was content with my role as Tyler's supporting character, rather than recognizing it as evidence that I'd been systematically trained to accept less than I deserved. Mrs. Williams also shared that news of my Harvard acceptance had spread throughout Riverside, despite my family's efforts to keep it quiet. The local newspaper had run a feature story about my scholarship, calling me an inspiration to other students from small towns who dreamed of attending prestigious universities. My former teachers had been interviewed about my academic performance, with several of them expressing surprise that my family hadn't been more publicly supportive of my achievement. The community is proud of you, Mrs. Williams said. People are talking about how remarkable it is that someone from Riverside earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. Your achievement is being celebrated by everyone except the people who should have been celebrating it from the beginning. That conversation helped me understand that my family's reaction to my success wasn't normal or justified, that other people recognized the extraordinary nature of what I'd accomplished while my own parents had treated it like an inconvenience. The validation I'd been seeking from them was flowing freely from teachers, community members, and neighbors who understood that Harvard Law School represented an incredible opportunity and achievement. 3 months into my first semester, I received a letter forwarded from my old address in Riverside. The return address showed it was from Tyler, and despite my better judgment, I opened it. The letter was exactly what I'd expected, a rambling justification for their treatment of me combined with accusations that I was being selfish and overdramatic. You always thought you were better than us, he wrote. Just because you got good grades and went to some fancy school doesn't mean you're more important than family. Mom and Dad gave you everything, and this is how you repay them. By disappearing and making them worry, you're being incredibly selfish, and I hope you realize that before it's too late to fix things. The letter confirmed that Tyler had learned nothing from my departure, that he still viewed my achievements as evidence of arrogance rather than hard work, that he genuinely believed my parents had given me everything, despite years of evidence to the contrary. He couldn't see that they'd given him everything while giving me the bare minimum, that they'd celebrated his mediocrity while ignoring my excellence, that they'd prioritized his comfort over my dreams at every opportunity. But rather than making me angry, Tyler's letter made me feel grateful for the clarity of my decision. These people would never understand what they'd done wrong because understanding would require acknowledging that their golden child wasn't actually golden, that their parenting strategy had failed, that the daughter they'd overlooked had become everything they'd hoped Tyler might be. I threw Tyler's letter away and returned to my constitutional law reading, to my study group discussions about civil rights cases, to my preparation for a career that would allow me to fight for justice and recognition based on merit rather than favoritism. Harvard had chosen me, Professor Mitchell believed in me, and I was finally learning to believe in myself without requiring anyone else's permission or validation. The girl who'd left Riverside with a single suitcase had found her home among people who valued excellence, who celebrated achievement, who understood that success was something to be proud of, rather than something to hide. Everyone had chosen me over them, and I'd finally learned to choose me too. The transformation began with small victories that nobody back home would ever witness. Making law review during my first year, earning recognition from professors who saw potential rather than problems, building friendships with classmates who celebrated each other's successes instead of minimizing them to protect someone else's feelings. Each achievement felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried under years of family dysfunction. My study group became the support system I'd never experienced growing up. When I aced my constitutional law midterm, Sarah Chen high-fived me and suggested we celebrate with coffee. When Marcus Rodriguez landed a prestigious summer internship, we all went out for dinner and spent the evening talking about his goals and dreams without anyone worrying that our enthusiasm might hurt someone else's feelings. These were people who understood that success was contagious, that celebrating one person's achievements created an environment where everyone could thrive. The contrast with my family's approach was so stark it sometimes took my breath away. These friends asked detailed questions about my career goals, offered connections in their networks, shared resources and opportunities without keeping score or worrying about fairness. They operated from an abundance mindset where one person's success created opportunities for others rather than the scarcity mindset I'd grown up with, where one person's achievement somehow diminished everyone else's value. During my second semester, I received an email that would change everything. Professor Mitchell had forwarded my name to the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, which was looking for students interested in family court advocacy. They'd read my application essay about growing up as the responsible child in a dysfunctional family system, and they wanted to discuss opportunities for me to work on cases involving educational neglect and parental favoritism. The interview was conducted by Jennifer Hayes, a family court attorney who specialized in cases where high-achieving children were being systematically undermined by their own families. She'd seen countless situations where parents prioritized managing one child's emotions over nurturing another child's potential, where family dynamics created environments that punished success and rewarded mediocrity. Your background gives you unique insight into these cases, she explained during our meeting. You understand both the legal and emotional complexities involved when families fail to provide appropriate support for their children's achievements. You've lived through the psychological impact of being consistently undervalued while watching less capable siblings receive unlimited resources and attention. The work was challenging and heartbreaking, representing teenagers who'd been denied educational opportunities because their success made less academically gifted siblings uncomfortable, advocating for children whose college funds had been redirected to pay for their siblings' repeated failures, fighting for recognition of academic achievements that families wanted to suppress for the sake of artificial harmony. One case particularly resonated with me, a 17-year-old named Emma, whose parents had refused to complete her college financial aid applications because her acceptance to multiple universities was making her brother feel inadequate. Emma's younger brother had struggled academically throughout high school, and rather than addressing his learning disabilities or motivation issues, the parents had decided that Emma's success was the problem that needed to be managed. Working on Emma's case felt like representing my younger self, fighting for the recognition and support that every achieving child deserves regardless of how their success affects family dynamics. We were able to secure a court order requiring the parents to complete the financial aid paperwork and to arrange alternative housing for Emma when they retaliated by making her home life unbearable. "Thank you," Emma said after the judge ruled in her favor. "Nobody ever stood up for me before. Everyone always said I should be more understanding of my brother's struggles, that I should try not to make him feel bad about my achievements. You're the first person who said that wasn't my responsibility." Her words echoed my own journey, the realization that high-achieving children shouldn't have to diminish themselves to protect underachieving siblings from reality, that families who create these dynamics are failing both children in different but equally damaging ways. Emma's case became the foundation for my law school thesis on educational equity within family systems, which later evolved into a published paper that gained national attention in family law circles. The recognition was intoxicating in the healthiest possible way. Legal journals wanted to publish my research, family court judges began citing my work in their decisions, and advocacy organizations invited me to speak at conferences about the intersection of family dynamics and educational opportunity. I was being celebrated for my intellect, my insights, my ability to articulate complex problems and propose practical solutions. During my third year, I received a call that initially confused me. The voice on the other end identified herself as Janet Martinez, Jamie's mother, calling from Riverside. She'd seen my published paper on family educational dynamics and recognized my name from the Harvard News that had circulated through their community 3 years earlier. "I hope you don't mind me calling," she said, "but I wanted you to know how proud our whole community is of what you've accomplished. Your work is being discussed by social workers and family counselors here in Ohio. You're making a difference for families who are struggling with the same issues you wrote about." She paused, then continued with obvious discomfort, "I also wanted you to know that your family situation has become something of a cautionary tale here in Riverside. People talk about how your parents failed to recognize your potential, how they prioritized Tyler's feelings over your achievements. It's opened up conversations about how families can do better by their high-achieving children." The irony was perfect and painful. My family had worked so hard to suppress recognition of my Harvard acceptance, to keep my achievements quiet to protect Tyler's ego, yet my absence had made my story more visible than my presence ever could have. People were talking about the girl who'd earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law School and been treated like an inconvenience by her own parents, the daughter who'd achieved everything they claimed to want while receiving none of the support they lavished on her underachieving brother. "Tyler's been having a hard time," Mrs. Martinez continued carefully. "He dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, lost his construction job, moved back in with your parents. People compare him to you now, talk about how different things might have been if your family had supported both of you appropriately, instead of playing favorites." I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing about Tyler's continued struggles, not satisfaction exactly, but a recognition that the family dynamic that had damaged me had ultimately damaged him too. By protecting him from consequences, by shielding him from competition, by giving him attention and resources he hadn't earned, they'd failed to prepare him for a world that wouldn't make those same accommodations. Tyler had never learned to work for recognition because he'd received it automatically. He'd never developed resilience because he'd been protected from failure. He'd never cultivated excellence because mediocrity had been celebrated in our house. My parents' favoritism had been as destructive to him as their neglect had been to me, just in different ways. Meanwhile, their neglect had accidentally given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I could succeed without their support, that my worth wasn't dependent on their recognition, that excellence was its own reward, regardless of whether anyone in my family appreciated it. Their failure to celebrate my achievements had taught me to celebrate myself. Their inability to see my potential had motivated me to prove it to people who mattered. The final vindication came during my law school graduation, when I was selected as valedictorian and invited to deliver the commencement address. As I stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of graduates and their families, I spoke about the importance of recognizing and nurturing excellence wherever it appears, about the responsibility we all have to celebrate achievement rather than suppress it for the comfort of others. "Some of you had families who believed in you from the beginning," I said, "who celebrated your victories and supported your dreams without reservation. Others of you, like me, had to learn to believe in yourselves, despite lacking that support. Both paths have value, both stories matter, but let's commit to ensuring that the children in our lives never have to choose between their achievements and their family's love." After the ceremony, Professor Mitchell approached me with tears in her eyes. "Alex, that speech was extraordinary. You've taken your personal pain and transformed it into wisdom that will help countless other students who are struggling with similar family dynamics. That's the highest form of healing." Standing there in my cap and gown, surrounded by classmates who'd become genuine friends, professors who'd invested in my potential, and mentors who'd helped me channel my experiences into meaningful advocacy work, I realized that everyone had indeed chosen me over them. Harvard had chosen me over thousands of other applicants, the Legal Aid Bureau had chosen me over dozens of other candidates, journal editors had chosen my research over competing submissions. Conference organizers had chosen my insights over more established speakers, but most importantly, I'd chosen me over them. I'd chosen my potential over their limitations, my dreams over their dysfunction, my future over their past. I'd stopped waiting for their recognition and started earning recognition from people who understood excellence when they saw it. That night, I celebrated with friends at a restaurant near campus, surrounded by people who were genuinely excited about my achievements and proud to know me. No one suggested we keep the celebration quiet to protect someone else's feelings. No one minimized my accomplishment to make others feel better about their own situations. No one treated my success like a problem that needed to be managed rather than a victory that deserved recognition. As I looked around the table at faces illuminated by genuine joy and pride, I realized I'd found what I'd been searching for my entire life: a chosen family who celebrated excellence, who supported each other's dreams, who understood that success was something to be shared and amplified rather than hidden and diminished. My parents had chosen everyone over me for 22 years, but now, everyone who mattered was choosing me over them. And that felt like the most natural progression in the world. The law firm's corner office overlooked downtown Boston's financial district, 43 floors above the street where I'd once stepped off a Greyhound bus with nothing but a suitcase and a Harvard acceptance letter. 5 years had passed since I'd walked away from Maple Street, 5 years of building a life that belonged entirely to me, 5 years of discovering what it meant to be valued for excellence rather than punished for it. Keller Morrison and Associates had recruited me directly from Harvard, impressed not just by my academic record,
but by my published research on family educational dynamics and my advocacy work with the Legal Aid Bureau. They specialized in family law with a focus on educational rights, and my background made me uniquely qualified to handle cases where high-achieving children were being systematically undermined by their own families. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd built an entire career around fighting for children who were experiencing exactly what I'd lived through, representing young people whose families couldn't celebrate their success because it highlighted other family members' failures. Every case felt personal. Every victory felt like healing not just for my clients, but for the younger version of myself who'd never had an advocate. My office walls were lined with framed articles from legal journals, commendation letters from family court judges, and photographs from conferences where I'd been invited to speak about educational equity and family dynamics. The recognition that had been withheld at home was flowing freely from professional colleagues who understood the value of expertise and insight earned through both education and experience. David Chen, the firm's senior partner, had become more than just a boss over the years. He'd taken on a mentoring role that my own father had never provided, offering guidance not just on legal strategies but on career development and personal growth. During our weekly meetings, he'd ask about my goals, my interests, my vision for using law as a tool for social change. He treated my professional development as an investment worth making, my potential as something worth nurturing. "Alex, I want to discuss something with you," he said during one of our Tuesday afternoon meetings. "The National Family Law Association is hosting their annual conference next month, and they've asked me to recommend someone to deliver the keynote address on educational advocacy. I immediately thought of you." The invitation was both thrilling and terrifying. The National Family Law Association conference drew over 2,000 attorneys, judges, social workers, and policymakers from across the country. The keynote address would be my opportunity to share my research and advocacy work with the people who had the power to implement systemic changes in how families and legal systems supported high-achieving children. The theme is recognizing potential legal frameworks for educational equity, Mr. Chen continued. Your combination of academic expertise, practical experience, and personal insight makes you the perfect speaker for this topic. You've lived through the issues you've spent your career fighting against, and that authenticity resonates with audiences in ways that purely academic presentations can't. I accepted the invitation immediately, understanding that this represented exactly the kind of platform I'd been working towards since my first day at Harvard. The opportunity to address the nation's leading family law experts about the intersection of family dynamics and educational opportunity felt like the culmination of everything I'd built since leaving Riverside. Preparing for the keynote required months of research, not just into legal precedents and policy frameworks, but into the personal stories of families who'd struggled with similar dynamics. I interviewed dozens of high-achieving children who'd been systematically undervalued by parents who couldn't handle their success, parents who'd sacrificed one child's potential to protect another child's ego. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different socio-economic levels, geographic regions, and family structures. Parents would unconsciously create environments where achievement was discouraged, where success had to be hidden or minimized to maintain artificial family harmony, where the high-achieving child learned to shrink themselves to accommodate everyone else's emotional needs. One case study particularly resonated with my own experience. A family in Colorado where the parents had refused to attend their daughter's medical school graduation because it would make her brother feel bad about dropping out of community college. The daughter, now a successful pediatric surgeon, had eventually cut contact with her family entirely after years of having her achievements treated as embarrassments rather than celebrations. "I spent my whole childhood being told I was selfish for wanting recognition," she told me during our interview. "They convinced me that caring about my own success was somehow taking something away from my brother. It took years of therapy to understand that families are supposed to celebrate each other's achievements, not suppress them." Her story and dozens of others like it became the foundation for my keynote address. I wasn't just presenting legal theory or policy recommendations, I was sharing the human cost of family systems that prioritized emotional management over individual growth, that treated success as a zero-sum game where one person's achievement necessarily diminished everyone else's value. The week before the conference, I received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Patricia Williams, my former supervisor at the Riverside Community Center. She'd seen the conference announcement online and wanted to congratulate me on being selected as the keynote speaker for such a prestigious event. "Alex, I've been following your career through various news articles and legal publications," she said, her voice warm with genuine pride. "You've become exactly what I always knew you could be, someone who uses their intelligence and experience to help others. I'm so proud of how you've transformed your personal struggles into professional advocacy." She paused, then continued with obvious discomfort. "I also wanted to let you know that your family situation here in Riverside has become quite well known. Your parents' treatment of your Harvard acceptance is discussed in parenting groups, social work circles, even at school board meetings. You've become a case study in what not to do when a child achieves something extraordinary." The revelation was both satisfying and sad. My parents had worked so hard to suppress recognition of my achievements, yet their failure to support me appropriately had made my story more visible than any celebration could have. They'd become cautionary tales in their own community, examples of how parental favoritism and emotional mismanagement could destroy family relationships and waste human potential. "Tyler's situation has continued to deteriorate," Mrs. Williams continued carefully. "He's been in and out of various jobs, had several run-ins with the law, still lives with your parents at 27. People in town talk about how different things might have been if your family had supported both children appropriately instead of sacrificing one for the other." I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing about Tyler's continued struggles, not satisfaction exactly, but a recognition that the family dynamic that had stunted my growth had ultimately stunted his as well. By protecting him from consequences, by giving him unearned attention and resources, by treating his mediocrity as acceptable, they'd failed to prepare him for a world that wouldn't make those same accommodations. Meanwhile, their neglect had accidentally equipped me with resilience, self-reliance, and an understanding that excellence was its own reward regardless of external recognition. Their failure to celebrate my achievements had taught me to find validation from people who actually mattered. Their inability to see my potential had motivated me to prove it in environments where merit was recognized and rewarded. "Your parents ask about you sometimes," Mrs. Williams added hesitantly. "They seem to want people to know that they're proud of your success, that they always supported your dreams."
But everyone remembers how they actually responded to your Harvard acceptance, how they tried to keep it quiet, how they prioritized Tyler's feelings over your achievement. The attempt to rewrite history was predictable and pathetic. Now that my success was public and celebrated, now that their failure to support me had become a source of community judgment, they wanted credit for achievements they'd actively discouraged. They wanted to be seen as the proud parents of a successful daughter rather than the dysfunctional adults who'd driven their most capable child away through years of systematic neglect. The National Family Law Association conference was held in Chicago, in a massive convention center filled with some of the country's most influential legal minds. As I stood backstage waiting to deliver my keynote address, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From a kitchen table in Riverside where my Harvard acceptance had been crumpled and thrown away, to a podium where I was about to address 2,000 people about the importance of recognizing and nurturing potential wherever it appears. The introduction was generous and detailed, highlighting my academic achievements, my published research, my advocacy work, and my role in securing precedent-setting court decisions that protected high-achieving children from family dynamics that undermined their educational opportunities. As I walked onto the stage, the sustained applause felt like the celebration I'd never received at home, the recognition that had been withheld by the people who should have been proudest of my accomplishments. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and confident despite the magnitude of the moment. "My name is Alex Thompson, and I'm here to talk about what happens when families fail to recognize potential, when parents choose comfort over celebration, when children learn that their achievements are problems to be managed rather than victories to be shared." I spoke about my own experience growing up as the high-achieving child in a family that couldn't handle success, about the psychological impact of being consistently undervalued while watching less capable siblings receive unlimited support and attention. I shared case studies from my advocacy work, stories of children whose educational opportunities had been sabotaged by parents who prioritized artificial family harmony over individual growth. The legal system has a responsibility to protect children not just from physical abuse, but from the psychological abuse of systematic devaluation, I continued. When families create environments where achievement must be hidden, where success requires apology, where potential is sacrificed to protect someone else's ego, we have a duty to intervene. The audience was completely engaged, many taking notes, others nodding in recognition of patterns they'd witnessed in their own professional practice. During the question and answer session, family court judges shared stories about cases involving educational neglect. Attorneys discussed strategies for advocating for high-achieving children in dysfunctional family systems. Policymakers asked about legislative frameworks that could better protect children's educational rights. Ms. Thompson asked a family court judge from Texas, "In your experience, what are the long-term outcomes for high-achieving children who receive appropriate family support versus those who don't?" The question struck at the heart of everything I'd learned through my research and personal experience. Children who receive appropriate support for their achievements develop healthy relationships with success, I replied. They understand that excellence is something to be proud of, that their accomplishments benefit not just themselves but their communities. Children who don't receive that support often struggle with imposter syndrome, have difficulty accepting recognition, and may even sabotage their own success because they've been taught that achievement creates problems. I paused, thinking about my own journey from the girl who apologized for her Harvard acceptance to the woman standing confidently at a podium addressing the nation's leading family law experts. But they can also develop extraordinary resilience, independence, and motivation. Some of the most successful advocates for educational equity are people who experienced educational inequity within their own families. After my presentation, I was surrounded by attendees who wanted to discuss specific cases, share similar experiences, or explore opportunities for collaboration. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several organizations expressing interest in bringing me in as a consultant on cases involving family educational dynamics. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, whom I'd worked with during law school, approached me after the formal reception had ended. "Alex, that presentation was extraordinary. You've taken your personal experience and transformed it into a framework that can help thousands of families navigate these issues more effectively. That's the highest form of healing and advocacy. Standing in that convention center, surrounded by colleagues who respected my expertise, judges who cited my research, and advocates who wanted to collaborate on future projects, I realized that the recognition I'd once desperately sought from my family had become irrelevant. I'd built a professional reputation based on merit and achievement, surrounded myself with people who celebrated excellence, created a life where success was expected and appreciated rather than hidden and minimized. The girl who'd left Riverside with a crumpled acceptance letter and a family that couldn't celebrate her achievements had become a woman whose work was changing how the legal system protected high-achieving children from family dysfunction. My parents had chosen Tyler over me for 22 years, but the legal community, my colleagues, my clients, and my chosen family had all chosen me over the limitations they'd tried to impose. That evening, alone in my hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that morning when my Harvard acceptance letter was thrown in the trash. I'd gone from being the daughter whose achievements were embarrassments to being the attorney whose achievements were helping other children avoid similar experiences. I thought about Tyler still living with our parents at 27, still struggling with the consequences of never learning to compete or excel or face reality. I thought about Robert and Linda Thompson, probably telling anyone who would listen that they'd always known I would be successful, that they'd always supported my dreams, that they were proud of everything I'd accomplished. But mostly I thought about the hundreds of children I'd represented, the families I'd helped restructure their dynamics to support all their children appropriately, the legal precedents I'd helped establish that would protect future generations of high-achieving children from the kind of systematic devaluation I'd experienced. My parents had taught me, through their neglect, that I didn't need their approval to succeed. They'd shown me, through their favoritism, that family love could be conditional and destructive. They demonstrated through their choices that some people would never have the capacity to celebrate excellence or recognize potential, but they'd also accidentally given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I was capable of succeeding without their support, that my worth wasn't dependent on their recognition, that excellence was its own reward regardless of whether the people who were supposed to love me could appreciate it. The keynote address marked the beginning of a new chapter in my career, with speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, and collaborative projects that would expand my ability to advocate for educational equity. I was building something meaningful and lasting, creating change that would outlive me, using my experience to ensure that other children wouldn't have to choose between their achievements and their family's love. 5 years after leaving Riverside, everyone who mattered had indeed chosen me over them. And more importantly, I'd learned to choose myself, to value my own potential, to celebrate my own achievements regardless of whether anyone else could appreciate them. That was the real victory, the transformation that mattered most, the freedom that made all the professional recognition meaningful. As I prepared for sleep in that Chicago hotel room, I smiled thinking about the girl who'd once hidden her Harvard acceptance letter to protect someone else's feelings. She'd become a woman who stood confidently in front of thousands of people, sharing her story and her expertise, using her voice to advocate for children who were living through similar experiences. My parents had chosen everyone over me, but I'd chosen to become someone worth choosing. And that had made all the difference. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning at my law office, hand-delivered by a courier service with instructions that it required my personal signature. The return address was unfamiliar, a legal firm in Riverside that specialized in estate planning and family matters. My hands trembled slightly as I signed for the delivery, though I couldn't quite understand why a communication from my hometown would provoke such an immediate physical response. Inside was a formal letter from attorney Margaret Foster, informing me that my grandfather, my father's father, whom I'd always called Grandpa Joe, had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks earlier. The letter explained that I'd been named as the primary beneficiary in his will, inheriting not just his savings and property, but also a collection of documents he'd specifically requested be delivered to me personally after his death. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa Joe had been the one family member who'd consistently shown interest in my achievements, who'd asked about my grades and celebrated my academic successes even when my parents treated them as routine occurrences. He'd attended my high school graduation when my parents had spent the ceremony discussing Tyler's summer job prospects, had sent me $20 bills with handwritten notes of encouragement throughout college. But I hadn't seen him in over 5 years, not since I'd left Riverside. My parents had apparently told him that I was too busy with my fancy career to visit family, that I'd become too important to maintain relationships with people from my small-town background. They'd effectively cut off communication between us, just as they'd tried to suppress recognition of my achievements to protect Tyler's feelings. The inheritance was substantial, more than I'd ever imagined my grandfather possessed. His modest house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from Maple Street where I'd grown up, was now mine, along with savings accounts that revealed he'd been living far below his means for decades. But the real treasure was the collection of documents Attorney Foster mentioned, a carefully organized file containing newspaper clippings, photographs, and letters that told a story I'd never known existed. Grandpa Joe had been following my career from a distance, collecting every article about my legal work, every mention of my advocacy cases, every photograph from conferences where I'd been featured as a speaker or panelist. He'd kept copies of my law school publications, printed screenshots of positive reviews from legal journals, even saved the program from the National Family Law Association conference where I'd delivered my keynote address. Each document was carefully labeled with dates and locations, organized chronologically to create a comprehensive record of my professional achievements. In the margins he'd written notes in his careful handwriting, comments like "so proud of our Alex and she's changing the world and knew she was special from the beginning." The file revealed that he'd been the family member I'd always needed, the one person who truly understood the significance of what I was accomplishing. But the most devastating discovery was a folder labeled "Letters Never Sent," containing dozens of handwritten notes addressed to me over the past 5 years. Letters congratulating me on cases I'd won, expressing pride in articles I'd published, sharing his thoughts about my advocacy work and its impact on families struggling with similar dynamics. Letters that had never reached me because my parents had convinced him that I didn't want contact with my Riverside family. One letter, dated just 6 months before his death, contained a passage that brought tears to my eyes. "Alex, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need you to know that you were always my proudest achievement as a grandfather. Watching you succeed despite your parents' inability to appreciate your gifts has been the greatest joy of my final years. I've tried to stay in touch, but your parents say you're too busy for family now. I hope someday you'll know that at least one person in this family always believed in you." The realization that Grandpa Joe had wanted to maintain our relationship, that he'd been actively documenting my achievements while being told I was too important to communicate with my family, created a grief so complex I didn't know how to process it. I'd lost not just my grandfather but years of connection with the one family member who genuinely celebrated my success. Attorney Foster's letter included additional information that deepened my understanding of what had transpired during my absence from Riverside. Grandpa Joe had apparently confronted my parents about their treatment of me, had questioned their decision to suppress recognition of my Harvard acceptance, had argued with them about the importance of supporting high-achieving children rather than protecting underachieving ones from reality. The confrontations had created a rift within the extended family, with some relatives supporting Grandpa Joe's position that I deserved recognition and celebration, while others sided with my parents' approach of prioritizing Tyler's emotional needs over my professional accomplishments. The division had become so pronounced that family gatherings were no longer held, relationships were strained, and communication had broken down across multiple generations. My success, the achievement that should have brought pride and unity to our family, had instead exposed fundamental differences in values and priorities that couldn't be reconciled. People were forced to choose between celebrating excellence and enabling mediocrity, between supporting merit-based recognition and maintaining artificial harmony. The family had fractured along lines that reflected broader societal debates about equality, achievement, and the responsibility families have to nurture all their children appropriately. The inheritance came with a choice that felt both obvious and terrifying. I could sell Grandpa Joe's house from a distance, maintain my complete separation from Riverside, and continue building my life without any connection to my hometown. Or I could return at least temporarily to settle his estate and perhaps gain closure on the family relationships that had shaped my understanding of recognition, achievement, and unconditional love. The decision was complicated by my awareness that returning to Riverside would inevitably involve contact with my parents, who would undoubtedly try to use my grandfather's death as an opportunity to reconcile. They'd probably claim that grief had given them perspective on their past mistakes, that losing Grandpa Joe had made them realize how much they missed their daughter, that they'd always been proud of my achievements despite their inability to express that pride appropriately. But I also realized that I'd reached a point in my professional and personal development where their opinions no longer had the power to diminish me. I'd built a life surrounded by people who celebrated excellence, who understood the value of recognition based on merit, who had chosen me consistently over the past 5 years. Their belated attempts at reconciliation couldn't touch the confidence I'd developed through genuine accomplishment and authentic relationships. After a week of consideration, I decided to return to Riverside for Grandpa Joe's memorial service and to spend a few days settling his estate. Not because I hoped for reconciliation with my parents, but because I owed my grandfather the respect of honoring his memory properly and ensuring that his final wishes were carried out according to his values rather than theirs. The memorial service was small but meaningful, attended by neighbors who remembered Grandpa Joe as a kind and generous man who'd always been proud of his granddaughter's achievements. Several people approached me to share stories about how he'd talked about my legal work, how he'd shown them articles about my advocacy cases, how he'd boasted about my success even when other family members discouraged him from doing so. My parents were there, of course, looking older and more worn than I remembered. They approached me after the service with expressions I couldn't quite read, something between hope and desperation, as if they'd been preparing for this moment for years but weren't sure how to navigate it. Their first words revealed that they still didn't understand the fundamental issues that had driven me away. "Alex," my mother said, reaching for my hand, "we're so glad you came. Grandpa Joe would have been so happy to see us all together again. We've missed you so much, and we're so proud of everything you've accomplished. We always knew you were destined for great things." The attempted rewriting of history was immediate and complete, as if 5 years of separation and a lifetime of differential treatment could be erased with a few sentences about how proud they'd always been. They seemed to believe that my grandfather's death had created an opportunity to reset our relationship without acknowledging the choices that had made that relationship impossible to maintain. But I was no longer the daughter who needed their validation, who would accept crumbs of recognition after years of deliberate neglect. I was a woman who'd built her own life, earned her own recognition, surrounded herself with people who appreciated excellence without conditions. Their belated pride meant nothing to me now because I'd learned the difference between authentic celebration and convenient revisionism. Standing in that funeral home surrounded by people who genuinely cared about Grandpa Joe and respected what I'd accomplished, I realized that my journey was complete. I'd gone from being the daughter nobody chose to being the woman everyone who mattered had chosen. My grandfather had been choosing me all along, documenting my achievements, believing in my potential, celebrating my success even when he couldn't express that celebration directly. His death marked not just the end of his life, but the end of my need for family recognition that would never come authentically. I'd found my chosen family among colleagues who valued my contributions, clients who appreciated my advocacy, and friends who celebrated my achievements without reservation. The circle was complete, the transformation was permanent, and the girl who'd once hidden her Harvard acceptance letter had become a woman whose grandfather had proudly collected every newspaper clipping that mentioned her name. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.